The NHL trade deadline is a little more than 5 weeks away. With time to decide, should the Edmonton Oilers be choosy or should they go for a big fish?
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Everyone, and welcome to this Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So, on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, a very simple, old school pros and cons list, and our final segment, we'll tackle what the verdict should be. So, as we sit here on January 30th, the Edmonton Oilers are in first place in the Pacific Division. The Edmonton Oilers are pursuing their first division title in 30 some odd years. I misread my notes there. The Oilers are currently on pace, as we sit here today, to record 110 standings points, which would be the most they've had in a season since 1985-1986. And with that as the backdrop, the foundational principle of this argument, we're going to start with the case for going out there and adding an impact player. Now, the market is still developing. Identifying who may or may not be available is not the easiest task in the world right now as we sit here in January, at the end of January, because all it's going to take is 1 or 2 good weeks in the month of February for teams that are in the middle right now, in both conferences, mind you, to convince themselves that they should stay in, that they shouldn't trade off expiring contracts, that they should go for it, that they should hold on to their guys and see if their run of quality form is an aberration or if it's something to build off of. And I think when you are in a situation like the Oilers, where you're putting together a really strong regular season and you still feel like you have a little bit more to squeeze out of your existing group, on yesterday's show, we talked about how there's probably a little bit more room for Draisaitl on the power play to eke out a little more production. How at 5-on-5, there's probably a little bit more room for some guys down the lineup like Nugent-Hopkins, Adam Henry, Connor Brown, Janmark to give a little bit more. And I'm not saying a lot more, but the idea here and the argument for adding a marquee or an impact player, and I know I read more than one column over the last few days making the case that the Oilers should pursue Mikko Rantanen this summer if Rantanen should get to unrestricted free agency if he and the Hurricanes aren't able to agree. That's a different conversation. I think that's something we can revisit later on, closer to the start of the start of the offseason, when we'll have an idea as to what the economics of the next year and a half to 2 years of the NHL are going to look like. I know we have a mandatory cap increase this upcoming summer that's going to take us from 88.5 to 92.5. And in theory, the year after that, we should be going up to 97.5. And the potential for real growth of salary cap north of $100 million is not that far off. But the Oilers and most teams, I shouldn't say specific to the Oilers, most teams are not going to be able to pay for the ideas they have just on salary cap increases. This is one of the concepts I've had an incalculable number of arguments over the last few days with some of my friends and with people online that, the cap's going up, it's fine. They'll figure it out. Do not bank on things that you cannot materially control yourself. That as much as the NHL, Gary and Bill Daly keep swearing, yeah, we're fine. Until the revenues are counted, do not bank on them. Because I have seen the NHL pull this before, where they have bad growth for year over year, and they say, well, we can't increase that much. We can't do that. Or they have extreme cases. You have pandemic that's taken 4.5 seasons to recover when the other sports were less than a season. Yeah. Salary caps in the other sports, baseball doesn't have a salary cap, but the basketball and football, their salary caps went down slightly year over year that 1 year. And then they paid off the missed opportunities that they had. But because the NHL is a revenue-driven league, a gate revenue-driven league, excuse me, it makes teams a lot more dependent on people showing up. And then you have the Coyote factor, where they were playing in a 5,000-seat arena for multiple seasons, which made it difficult for revenues to meet their thresholds to increase the salary cap. So with all of that said, the Oilers, as far as adding, and I know, and we'll get to it in the con segment, there are going to be people who comment under this video, well, they're going to add Evander Kane, whether that's after the deadline or the playoffs. They added John Klingberg. They could potentially add Brandon Saad or Jonathan Toews. Those are not marquee or impact players. I think Evander Kane can be functional as a third liner. I think Brandon Saad could probably be a little more functional than Jeff Skinner. I think Jonathan Toews at this stage might be better than what Derek Ryan was giving you. And if you prefer his playoff experience to Noah Phillips' lack of playoff experience, sure. But the Oilers absolutely can swing here. And last year, we saw a genuine arms race in the Western Conference where quality opponents went out and got better. The Vegas Golden Knights adding Tomas Hertl and Noah Hanifin, the Canucks adding Elias Lindholm, the Stars adding Chris Tanev. There was a real race to improve everyone's team. And the West is significantly better than the East. And anything you can do to improve your team's chances of winning the Stanley Cup, that's your fundamental responsibility as a general manager of a team that has cup aspirations. The Oilers are having a tremendous regular season. And the most important thing for me is twofold. Number one, immaterially, non-tangibly, it sends a really strong message to the guys on your team. Hey, number one, we appreciate and we recognize the work you're putting in. Here's some help. That's how I always try to look at the trade deadline or in-season additions, regardless of the sport, is if you're a general manager and you like what you've seen from your team so far and you want to reinforce it, bolster it, give it some real juice to believe in, to feel good about itself, I think it's really invaluable, and it sent a strong message to the guys on your team that we appreciate you, we care, we want you to succeed. Here's some more help. And then number two, on top of that, the more lineup flexibility you have, the better. You know, you saw in the playoffs last year. Sure, Adam Henrique has mostly played third line center this year. There were stretches in the playoffs when he was in the lineup where he was playing first line right wing, riding with McDavid and Hyman. And this year, we've seen some lineup variants where we've seen guys like Kasperi Kapanen play with Leon Draisaitl. We have seen Nuge play with McDavid. We've seen Connor Brown play with McDavid. We've seen Zach Hyman on the third line. You know, the more versatility the Oilers have and opportunities they have to deploy quality players, all it's going to do is make your lineup deeper and give you more options. And I love when a team has little drop off from line to line. You know, ideally, you want to roll all four lines, all three pairs, roll your backup goalie every third or fourth start. And you want to feel good about doing that. You don't want to be walking on eggshells, worried, nervous that it's not going to work for you. It's really valuable as a coach and frankly for the guys on that team that, man, I'm only on the third line, but I'm on the third line. We have a really deep team. You know, on some teams, on a lower quality team, Adam Henrique might be the second line center on a lower quality team. Zach Hyman, he'd be stapled to that first line. Nuge on a bad team might be a second line center. And instead, you have the options. You have the versatility to say, depending on the matchup, depending on the look we're getting, we can roll this out there or we can roll that out there. And that's invaluable as a coach and as a team because you need every advantage you can get. We are going to take our first break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. And coming up next, we're going to take the cold bucket of water and talk about why the Oilers should be making targeted additions as opposed to a big swing coming up next. So be sure to stick around. Attending NFL playoff games is an unforgettable experience that brings fans together. My football team has not been very good in a long time, sans 2022, which was an absolute mirage. So it's been a while for me since I've been to an NFL playoff game. But I still vividly remember that from, 14 years ago now. And going to a playoff game, the environment, the energy, everyone's got their chests puffed out, the tailgate, everyone's talking trash. It's really a great feeling. And Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for NFL playoff games even easier. It filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. If you wanted to go to the Super Bowl in New Orleans this year, support the Birds, or look for the three-peat, you could head on over to Gametime. Check out a super deal, which is especially impressive and offers the best value for the event. The app's features like seat views before you buy and all-in pricing with no surprise fees at checkout make the experience smooth and reliable. Plus, the one-time on-time ticket delivery and lowest price guarantee gives every user peace of mind. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers. Want to say, messed up my days of the week recording the episode yesterday. Did not realize I would have an episode for Thursday during the day prior to the game on Thursday, but alas, there will be an episode after the game tonight and this episode that'll go out during the day. So just wanted to clarify that if you're watching this and confused after watching or listening to yesterday's show. So the counterpoint and the voice of reason or rationality, if you will, never advocates for the big swing at the deadline. And this year, the big swing might have already happened in Mikko Rantanen going to Carolina. There's not a player better than Mikko Rantanen that's going to get traded this year. You know, there's maybe 10 guys in the whole sport you would take before Rantanen. The Oilers have 2 of them. The Avalanche have 2 of them. The Lightning have 1 of them. The Wild have 1 of them. And then it really starts to get hard. You could probably say the Leafs have 2, maybe 3, depending on how you feel about Nylander and Marner. There's not a lot of guys you're taking before Mikko Rantanen. So that degree of swing, you know, the biggest fish in the pond, probably not on the table this year. There's not even really someone to the caliber of Jake Gensel. That's who was the biggest acquisition last year. That's probably available to the Oilers. And I know there are going to be people who say, well, Nick, why won't you call the Canucks? I promise you, the Canucks are going to make trying to get JT Miller or Elias Pettersson, who I both think are good hockey players. And I think the Oilers would be able to transition them into the team, assimilate them, whatever word you want to use to make the fit work happen, because they're gifted players and the Oilers are a good team. I think the Canucks would make that price really unrealistic. And the big reason the Oilers probably don't go big game hunting is twofold. Number one, the Oilers don't have a ton of assets. They don't really have a robust prospect pool because they've been so good the last handful of years. That's the trade-off you make, that if you're good in the regular season, you're consistently making the playoffs, you have to eventually start to draft well or translate guys you've developed in the long term to NHLers. And the Oilers haven't really done that. And without a ton of prospects to use in a trade, you're going to have to use your draft picks. And the Oilers have burned draft picks selectively over the last handful of seasons when the opportunity's been right to improve the roster. And I have no qualm with that. You know, I said it in that first segment for a reason. If you have a good team, you should do your job and make the team better. But the second half of why it's not always the best idea, a trade deadline acquisition of 1 or 2 players is not fundamentally going to materially alter your team's playoff fortune. And barring the superstar trade, you know, the Rantanen level trade, okay. If you want to say that makes the Hurricanes 2-3% more likely to win the Stanley Cup, sure, I'll give you that. I don't have the math. I haven't looked at how cup odds have changed in the last week since the trade went through. But when you add an Adam Henrique and Sam Carrick like the Oilers did last year at the deadline, I like the additions. I thought they made sense. The Oilers needed a center, and they needed they needed a 4th line center, and they needed a top 9 forward. The additions in a vacuum made sense. The return on investment for trade deadline acquisitions is not great. Most of the time, you are going to burn a 1st or a 2nd round pick, one of your better prospects, and then something else, whether that's a lower tier prospect or a mid-round pick. for 20 regular season games, 15 regular season games, and then hopefully a Stanley Cup. But when you go back and look at the acquisitions that have worked out in recent years, where teams that have won the Stanley Cup, the type of player they've targeted, last year for the Panthers, it was Tarasenko, who top 9 forward at this stage of his career, not making a whole lot of money, expiring contract, has been on quite a few teams at the last handful of seasons and is still functional, but not somebody who's that impactful on an individual basis, a supporting character, if you will. The year before that, the Golden Knights went out and they got Ivan Barbashev, and ultimately they chose to keep Ivan Barbashev over Jonathan Marchessault, which interesting in evaluating that decision, but Barbashev wasn't that costly, useful, functional player, but not somebody who swings a game by themselves, not someone who's that impactful. You could say the same thing for Chandler Stevenson, who the Golden Knights let walk, in addition, someone they chose Barbashev over. But continuing down that list, you think about it in the vacuum. You go to that Colorado team, Josh Manson, not a huge trade, nothing particularly huge or impactful in making that happen. Those Tampa Bay teams, Barclay Goodrow, Blake Coleman, David Savard, nice additions, but not singular driving forces. And that's really the key here. Because hockey is so high variance, and for the record, the most upsets in the postseason of the 4 major North American sports, the format is conducive to short runs being fluky, where a goalie getting hot or a power play getting hot or one player getting hot can swing a playoff series. So going out there and burning futures, you use a first round pick on a player, you've got team control of them for at least the minimum of 3 years before their first restricted free agent contract. And then you have ultimate control of them for 7 years after they're drafted. It's 7 years or 27 years old, whichever happens first, where they're allowed to become an unrestricted free agent and have the ability to negotiate with the entire league and acquire as much capital as they possibly can for their goods and for their services. And it is fundamental that a team draft well to maintain a window of contention, because you need those cost control players. You need guys to be supporting pieces that don't make a lot of money, especially when you're a team like the Oilers that is paying superstar talent the money they deserve. They still have to take care of Evan Bouchard. They still have to take care of McDavid. That is going to be a lot of money. If we're sitting here 2 years from now and the Oilers are looking at the possibility of paying McDavid and Draisaitl alone, just the two of them, 30, and Bouchard probably 10, you're talking about $40 million for 3 players. It becomes essential that you draft guys that can fill in your bottom 6 for that rookie 875, 925, 1.25, whatever tier of salary they're on, even if you want to account for rookie bonuses, incentive bonuses. But it's hard to do that when you're picking in the 20s or in the 30s like the Oilers have the last few years. It's important that you can turn over guys. So they're not being a huge swing to take. The Oilers not having a ton of great assets. The market isn't really there for the Oilers to take a big swing if you want to look at this from the negative position. But we're going to take one more break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we're going to make a case as to what I think the Oilers should do coming up next. So be sure to stick around. And thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers, where we're making the case as to whether or not the Oilers should go out and make a big move. And of course, big move is subjective, where what state your team is in, how competitive you are. A team like the Blue Jackets going out and trading for Elias Pettersson, that'd be a big swing for a team that doesn't really have a whole lot of track record of success, that type of thing. But for the Oilers, and I'm going to make a case that they are not going to make a move. And that's not necessarily me saying that's what I would do. I'm saying that the evidence before us would lead you to believe, especially what's been reported by various sources, whether you want to go with Bob Stauffer, with Drager, with Chris Johnston, whomever you want to use, The Oilers are looking at specialized guys. They want a right-handed defenseman who's defense first, who has a little bit of size, who can kill penalties if needed. They want a top 9 forward who can play center or wing. Neither of those screams like Ivan Provorov or JT Miller. I think the Oilers being associated or linked to Brandon Saad, who Stauffer on Oilers Now had mentioned that he thinks there might be a connection there. Stan Bowman, of course, was Brandon Saad's general manager in Chicago. Traded for him 2 separate times and lost both times, which if you want to go look at a funny trade tree, go look at the history of Brandon Saad getting traded and what Stan Bowman got in return for him. But I digress on that front because I know how sports work, and teams love to do the internal deadline acquisition of a player that's coming back from injury. And Evander Kane is going to be the big addition. And I know that might upset some. I'm not necessarily banking on Evander Kane returning to hockey for the first time in 10 months and being impactful right away. That's not how sports work. Like, even if he physically feels okay, it's going to take a few weeks to ramp up. And even if all timelines go well and they can sneak him in a regular season game before the playoffs start, it takes a while to feel good about your feet under you and getting into game shape and game speed. You know, I always say, no matter how hard you practice, no matter how hard you work, there is nothing that is going to replicate that first time you go out there and the guy on the other team is going to try and take your head off. You know, it's different in practice where there's the implied causation of we're teammates, we're going to bump, but we're not going to kill each other out here. It's very different when you go out there for the first time in a competitive ass game and have to make that play, and the other team isn't going to let up on that hit. And that's not questioning Evander Kane's toughness or anything. That's just how the human body works. You get into a routine, you get into a habit, it's easier to ramp yourself back up for that. You know, I think about every day when I go out for a run, I start with a few minutes of dynamic stretching, you know, get into some dips, move my hips around, try and open up my hip flexors. I'm into that routine now. If I were to try and go out there and run cold, which I don't advise once you get past like the age of 23, it's going to hurt a lot more the next day because your muscles were not warmed up. You were not prepared. Your routines prepare you for what you're going to do. And it's really important that you ramp yourself up. Same thing with John Klingberg, who may or may not be ready to go soon. There have been reports they're going to try and get him in the lineup on Saturday against the Maple Leafs. We'll see if he's good to go. We'll see the trickle-down effect that has on the rest of the lineup. And if they feel like Klingberg is good enough to play, that he can force one of Troy Stetcher or Emberson to the bench, depending on the opponent, and they only need to go out and add, you know, a 7th or 8th defenseman, I think that entirely rules them out for swinging for an Ivan Provorov or someone of that ilk, you know, a top 4 defenseman who can play upwards of 20 minutes a night, maybe one, if not both of the special teams units. I think that takes them out of there. Up front, it's easy to find 20-goal guys who are interesting. It's really easy to go out there. Like we said last year about Tarasenko with Florida, where I like that type of addition when you can make it if you're positioned well. There are plenty of players out there capable with a slight change of scenery and capable of going for a big addition. And look, there are varying degrees here. If you want to go out there and say something along the lines of maybe the Oilers should be looking at Brock Nelson of the New York Islanders or Chris Kreider of the New York Rangers, I wouldn't be opposed to that. I think you can make a really strong argument that dropping Chris Kreider on the Oilers' third line or Brock Nelson on the third line and moving Henrique to wing, I think that could unlock a lot of things for the lineup. Of course, you'd have to figure out how the money works, but I personally would be looking at a tier of player of that ilk. I would be looking to go out and get somebody who's capable of making a real impact. And you could look at it from a different perspective. Maybe you want to look at a team that's having a bit of a letdown season. Maybe you want to say, well, if we go out and we trade for, say, like Dylan Cousins, we could have Dylan Cousins on the team for the next 2 or 3 years before we have to really, really pay him as an unrestricted free agent. And maybe we could use this as an opportunity to get a little bit younger throughout our lineup and have a guy who we can mold a little bit and develop a little bit more and see if we can get more out of him than what he currently is. There are players out there that could use a change of scenery, that might be able to be more in Edmonton if given the shot. And that's really what the deadline is about for me, is finding ways to add things your lineup doesn't have. You could do something weird. Like, I don't think the Oilers should trade for Trent Frederick because I don't think Trent Frederick is that good, but he uniquely brings stuff the Oilers don't have. He brings size, he brings energy, he brings a little bit of tenacity, a little bit of ruggedness, you know, the POS traits that GMs love come the playoffs. Those type of skill sets are valuable, and you could very well make an argument that he brings something the Oilers don't have. You could look at someone like Ryan O'Reilly, or I wouldn't put Yanni Gourde in the mix because, frankly, I don't think the Kraken would trade for him. And, I don't think the Kraken would trade him in the division, but there's absolutely an argument. You go out there and you say, I can't worry about next year. This is the last year I'm going to have McDavid, Bouchard, and Draisaitl on reasonable contracts. After this, year to year, the surgery is going to be tough. We're going to need multiple guys making less than $2 million a year going forward in our bottom six and on our third and fourth defensive pairs. We're going to need long-term replacements for Matthias Ekholm, for Adam Henrique, Corey Perry, for Janmark. You go through the lineup guy by guy. There's a lot of late 20s. There's a lot of early 30s. There's some cost certainty over the next year and a half or so. But make no mistake, salary cap increases overall are not going to pay for the Oilers' improvements and changes. They are not going to pay for a McDavid extension, a Bouchard extension. That's not how it works. Fundamentally, it's not. But if I haven't confused you enough in this final segment, I think the Oilers should go out there and get a Brock Nelson caliber player, because someone else in the West is, whether that's the Wild, whether that's the Stars, whether that's the Kings. There is going to be a rush to acquire impact players in the West because the West is so much better than the East. And while I feel reasonably strong about the Oilers team as it currently constituted, may or may not see them add Brandon Saad in the following days as well, I think there's always room to be better. And I don't think if you're the Oilers, you can be particularly hung up on, well, what does this mean for next year and the year after that? When this is the last year, you have real cost control over your best players. That'll do it for today's show. I will talk to you guys after the game tonight. See you guys then. And until then, let's go Oilers.